What comes to mind when you hear the name Nelson Mandela? It's not hard to imagine his smile, his steadfast approach to equality and civil rights, and of course his role in ending apartheid in South Africa. He was a peacemaker, to be sure. As I started researching Mandela, I began to realize that there was more to his story than I had been able to glean from the news or in passing over the years. As I stated, Nelson Mandela lived his life mostly for peace. He was a uniter but also a fighter. Nelson Mandela, born Rolihlahla Mandela of the Madiba clan, was born in 1918 in the village of Mvezo, South Africa. He started his British education at age 7 and attended various schools. He studied for his Bachelor of Arts degree at the University College of Fort Hare, but deserted it to avoid an arranged marriage, something I think we could all understand. He actually finished his BA degree at the University of South Africa in 1943. And while there in the city of Johannesburg, he saw the tragedy of apartheid in urban South Africa firsthand. This inspired him. Later in life, Nelson Mandela helped end apartheid and became president of South Africa. And he was actually in prison for almost 30 years before that, when apartheid ended, thanks largely to his contribution, and he was released afterwards. He was elected head of the African National Congress Party and won the office of presidency in 1994 by a landslide. He was the first black leader of South Africa since white rule and served as president for one term before stepping down in 1999. Mandela actually unified South Africa in a way never seen before. One of his more interesting moves was when he chose to keep the Springboks as the national rugby team. Rugby was the national pastime for white South Africans, and the black population was opposed to this because to them it represented apartheid, the white ruling class, racism. However, Mandela had a plan to concede this seemingly minor victory to the whites, who still controlled things like the military and the police and hospitals. Madiba, as he was known to his people, managed to rally the entire nation behind a previously struggling rugby team in the name of sport, ultimately achieving the difficult task of a peaceful transition from a white-controlled apartheid government to a democracy which included equal rights for both blacks and whites after the Boks won the Rugby World Cup in 1995. Of course, that is the Mandela we all know. We've seen the movies, we've seen the news, but there's a side of Madiba which we may not always associate with this great man. His life in Johannesburg after college led to an interesting line of work. He began attending African National Congress meetings and actually joined in 1944. And this was a group that actually believed in nonviolent civil disobedience. In other words, a nonviolent approach to changing the government. He rose to the top of the ANC, helping form the ANC Youth League, and eventually adopted a program of action in 1949. Shortly thereafter, in 1952, he helped launch the Defiance of Unjust Laws campaign as one of his first big steps in South African civil rights. He traveled around South Africa supporting this cause until the government decided that he was a threat, and they limited his mobility in an effort to silence his message so that he couldn't spread the word for equality and an end to apartheid. After becoming a lawyer, he was arrested in 1956 with 150 other activists, and he was charged with treason, but later acquitted. In 1960, a group of police killed several peaceful protesters in Sharpeville, prompting Mandela to adopt a policy of violence, as opposed to the nonviolent approach that the ANC was usually in favor of. Now, most of us do not associate Mandela with violence. He felt it was not enough to protest violent acts in a peaceful manner. He actually led a firebombing raid on a government building in 1961 for the Umkhonto weSizwe, or Spear of the Nation, of course being labeled a terrorist in the process. In 1962, Nelson left South Africa, going underground, to garner support for his cause, the end of apartheid, and also to avoid any prosecution that the government might want to throw him in jail for. Of course, he was arrested upon his return, eventually being charged with sabotage and conspiracy to overthrow the government. Now, he chose not to defend himself. He felt the charges were ridiculous, and in lieu of a non-defense, he was sentenced to life in prison. Of course, this is the Mandela we mostly know as well as him serving his time on Robben Island, which was 7 miles off the coast of Cape Town. And that's when he actually became an icon for the opposition to apartheid. He was world famous for his fight and became world famous and wrote a few books while he was in prison. He was even offered freedom several times in exchange for his vow to renounce violence. But on principle, he refused each and every offer. Eventually, the South African government declared the ANC a legal entity, and Nelson Mandela was released from prison, resulting in his leadership of a nation in the throes of change. Nelson Mandela. His name, for my generation, is associated with all positive imagery. Peaceful civil rights activist, hero, champion of South Africa. In fact, there's not many people that figure more prominently into the conversation of peaceful unification than Nelson Mandela. However, as important as his role was in the unification of South Africa is the fact that he was actually a warrior. He was both fighter and uniter. And to ignore his violent past is to do injustice to his story and his legacy.